Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Really quickly, your department oversees the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which I'm sure you're aware recently proposed the CAFE standards for 27 to 32. You're also likely aware that the EPA agency has separately proposed overlapping greenhouse gas standards. Sir, can you explain what actions you've taken to coordinate with the EPA Administrator Reagan to ensure that auto manufacturers that comply with greenhouse gas regulations are also compliant with fuel economy standards issued by DOT?
Thanks for the question. We recognize that the development of two related but different sets of standards, one from NHTSA with regard to fuel economy, one from EPA with regard to emissions, can be a complicated thing for industry to deal with if we're not as transparent and coordinated as possible and as appropriate, while of course recognizing we're still separate agencies. And so we have worked to the extent appropriate in coordination with EPA and with the White House.
All right, well, I'll get more specific. Specific to the DOT, CAFE standards in model year 2732 indicate automakers will pay $10 to $13 billion in civil penalties for noncompliance. Mr. Secretary, will these penalties increase or decrease the vehicle cost for the average American buyer?
Well, if there's a failure to comply and there's a penalty assessed and the automaker puts that penalty on the back of the consumer, then their costs will increase. On the other hand, the consumer will be saving money thanks to the reduced gas that they'll be buying thanks to the standards, and we estimate saving about $1,000 per.
Okay, so let's assume that we go forward. Are those penalties reinvested by DOT in programs that would actually support more efficient vehicles, pollution reduction, or workforce development, or do they go to the general fund as essentially an implicit tax on the American people, which is the role of Congress?
I'm not in a position to speak to the use of penalty funding that hasn't been collected yet, but certainly think that partnering with Congress, it could be appropriate to make sure it gets assigned in ways that further the policy goal, provided they don't amount to undercutting the purpose of the penalty in the first place, which is to get the automaker to do the right thing and comply so that there's no penalty at all.
Would another right thing be profit sharing with UAW?
Say again?
Would another right thing be profit sharing with the UAW?
We certainly think that auto workers ought to get their fair share of the growth and the.
So you agree that profit sharing with UAW is something that is proper. These penalties.
Just to be clear, I'm not at the negotiating table, and I'm not going to.
Neither of us are, but both of us. I'm here to protect my workers here.
Efforts to make
so
sure
with the president's unrealistic projection for electric vehicle sales in the future, 67% by year 2032, affecting the profitability of these plants is going to take dollars away from auto workers. The approximate formula is about $1,000 per auto worker for $1 billion for the automakers. If penalties are levied on the automakers, then this will take money away from the auto workers. Is the president aware that he's literally taking money away from UAW workers by impugning their bonuses?
I just don't think that's the right characterization because it assumes that the auto workers will fail to comply with the law. The automakers will fail to comply with the law. Look, ever since the first CAFE standards were introduced in the Nixon administration, industry said, there's no way we could possibly have vehicles more efficient than 13.5 miles a gallon. There's been a push-pull to make sure that we have the maximum feasible. But in the end, industry got it done. And today, American consumers have saved billions and billions of dollars. And of course, we have cleaner air because of these standards. And I have a lot of confidence that industry can continue as they have done in the past.
I have a lot of confidence in the industry as well, but requiring going from 67%, and you mentioned earlier tripling, but that tripling is up to 7% now, and requiring that in just a handful of years goes beyond aggressive and goes into the area of dangerous. Look, I really appreciate you bringing up Penelope Rose and Joseph August. I have my little boys, and we have a hybrid electric vehicle that we plug in as well. But there's a housing crisis throughout America with affordability, and right now, this is not only going to affect the automotive industry, it's going to affect average, everyday Americans. Based on the president's unrealistic projection, can you explain what's being done in apartment complexes for Americans, whether it be folks suffering from a housing crisis in northern Michigan or in my district, in the southern portion of my district, making vehicle charging convenient at a reasonable cost for people already paying rent that's high? What do you think is acceptable? And what's the DOT doing to help make this charging more affordable?
Thanks. It's an excellent question, and it's one of the reasons why we have the community fueling infrastructure funding alongside or as part of the NEVI program. We recognize that especially, look, if you have a single-family home, you already have charging infrastructure. You can plug, if you have a garage, you can plug in there. But if you're in a multifamily dwelling, as many low-income Americans are, you can't assume that you're going to have that kind of charging infrastructure. And you also can't assume that it is yet profitable for a company to put it in. That is exactly why we're applying the funds that were provided by Congress to make sure that in these areas where it just doesn't yet pencil out for a company to do it, that we're buying down that difference so that some of the very Americans who would most benefit in terms of their family budget from the savings that come with filling up with electricity instead of gas can actually access it through affordable and convenient chargers.
One last thing, Mr. Secretary. Seeing electric vehicles don't pay a corresponding user fee for the Highway Trust Fund, such as the 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline. How does the CAFE reduce collections in the trust fund? I don't believe there's anything in the DOT's proposed rulemaking explaining what the high rate of electrification will mean for improvements to our nation's roads and bridges. Effectively, this rising debt of the federal government will put increased pressure on Congress and this committee to fund infrastructure improvements through the general fund, and that seems to be a major omission in the administration being honest about ensuring our nation's roads and bridges don't deteriorate further due to the higher CAFE and greenhouse gas requirements, and further pushing the cost of this EV transition onto folks who are least able to afford it. Can you comment on how we can maintain our infrastructure with the increased weight and decreased funding for our infrastructure?
Sure, and again, ever since CAFE standards began in the Nixon administration, improving the average efficiency of a car past 13.5 miles per gallon, there has been the effect, alongside all of the money that it saves drivers and car owners, that it also means that because Americans are paying less for gas, they're paying less gas tax. We think Americans paying less for gas is a good thing. We think Americans paying less gas tax because they're getting more efficient vehicles is a good thing. But we recognize that that means there have to be alternative ways to support the Highway Trust Fund. Historically, Congress has filled that gap through general dollars. That's not the only way to do it, but it's certainly a legitimate way to do it, and it's what has been happening ever since that gap first opened up.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time has expired.